morning, everybody. Good morning. It's JPR, and welcome back to another video. Legendary Pokemon have been a big topic of discussion lately, given how differently Scarlet and Violet opted to handle its two-box legendaries. In a strange twist, you start the games traveling alongside Koraidon and Miraidon, as opposed to every other game where your adventures lead up to your encounters with the legendaries. If you went on YouTube at the time this was revealed, you probably thought it was the end of legendary Pokemon as we knew it. But was it really that bad in the final product? So today, I'm going through all 9 regions to rank how they treated all of their legendary Pokemon. Their lore, their encounters, their presentation, which regions make legendary Pokemon feel the most legendary. And of course, we'll be doing it in the classic worst to best format. Let's get into it. Coming in last place is, fittingly enough, the region with the fewest legendaries, Kalos. Only 3 legendaries were introduced this gen, but that's not exactly a bad thing. If anything, I kinda enjoyed the lack of legendaries in this gen after Sinnoh and Unova went kinda crazy with them. Let's start with Xerneas and Yveltal though, since they are by far the most important. In terms of the lore the game presents, these two certainly don't have a lot. They embody life and death, and they went into a 3,000-year-long coma. That's about all they got. They aren't even mentioned until Sycamore randomly name-drops them in Dendemil Town towards the end of the game. I guess because the devs realized they actually needed to establish who the legendary Pokemon were at some point. Pretty much all of the Kalos lore up until this point in the game revolves entirely around the ultimate weapon rather than Xerneas and Yveltal themselves. And yes, while they are later revealed to be the Pokemon Lysander is using to power the ultimate weapon, they still end up feeling more like an afterthought compared to previous box legendaries, especially Groudon and Kyogre, Dialga and Palkia, and Zekrom and Reshiram. Even the setting you find them in isn't the most interesting, as it's quite literally just Team Flare's basement. I was hoping that we'd actually get to see the location where these two powerful Pokemon were slumbering for 3,000 years, but alas, Team Flare got there first. Next comes Zygarde, who I think needs no introduction. It's no secret Zygarde definitely got shafted in Kalos due to the lack of a Pokemon Z, having almost all of its lore and forms transferred over to Alola instead. I will give points to it for making you go deep into the optional dungeon of Terminus Cave to find it. I always like it when legendaries reward exploration. But that's really all the credit I can give to it. As for the legendary birds, these are handled possibly the worst of any roaming legendaries. Roaming legendaries always have been and always will be incredibly annoying. But in Kalos, they take it to a whole new level. First of all, you can't even find all 3 birds, which really sucks for a game that already lacks a lot of legendary Pokemon. Instead, you only get 1, which is determined based on who your starter was, because that was definitely something I was supposed to know going into the game. Anyhow, you have to encounter these birds a whopping 10 times across Kalos before they finally retreat to their final location, Sea Spirit's Den. Which, I might add, is a clear reference to Lugia, despite it not appearing in the game at all. Talk about an underwhelming tease. But yeah, you chase these guys around the region for way longer than you need to, and you don't even have the option to battle them because they just flee as soon as the encounter starts. It would have been nice if you still had the option to use Block or Mean Look to prevent them from fleeing, or just chuck a quick ball to test how many lottery tickets you should be buying this weekend. Now, the idea of the birds retreating to the den after 10 encounters out of pity for people who couldn't trap it doesn't sound so bad. But since the 10 random encounters are required, it comes off as more of a painfully long goose chase rather than a legendary bird hunt. Oh yeah, and Mewtwo's here for some reason. Ignoring the complete lack of explanation around that, it's also pretty underwhelming. Pokemon Village isn't a particularly off-the-map area like Terminus Cave is, no matter how much the game tries to convince you otherwise, and the cavern itself is less of a cavern and more of a timeout room for Mewtwo to stand there doing an ominous Dio pose. Coming in second from the bottom is the Johto region, which really pains me to say since it's the region that began establishing lore for many legendary Pokemon and treating them as these mythological creatures. But undeniably, especially in Gold and Silver, the 5 legendaries aren't handled well at all. Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, while being sick designs with even sicker lore, yeah, they burned to death in the tower, isn't that rad? They did introduce roaming legendaries to the series, so boo you stink! I'm not even gonna talk about how they made Suicune the important one in Crystal 2, that's just weird considering Ho-Oh is already supposed to be the Trio Master. As for Ho-Oh and Lugia, the very first box legendaries in existence, they receive basically 0 fanfare when they actually show up in the game. It's just kinda like, oh, you got the wing from this random radio dude, okay, so go catch them now, I guess. They aren't exactly hard to track down either, they're pretty much exactly where you'd think they'd be. Now, Heart Gold and Soul Silver certainly improves in the legendaries quite a bit. Ho-Oh and Lugia still don't have a ton of plot associated with them, but at least they found a way to tie the Kimono Girls into them. And hey, they actually have cutscenes and battle themes now. Who would have guessed that would have actually made them feel more special? Entei and Raikou still roam, so they suck. but Suicune gets its crystal plot expanded on a little bit, which is nice. Groudon and Kyogre are kind of a random addition to the post-game, and while I think it's cool content, I was never too hot on having to trade with a friend to unlock Rayquaza. It's neat, but it definitely just kind of feels like filler. As for the birds and Mewtwo, they're only in Kanto and basically just repeat what was already done in Gen 1, but slightly less cool. Latios and Latias are also here, but mostly just as promotion for a later event involving Steven, and they also roam, so boo! Anyway, while I definitely appreciate Johto attempting to make legendaries feel important, they definitely still fall a bit flat in some departments. And ultimately, I do have to put the most stock into Gold and Silver since they are the original games. Coming in 7th is Alola, and in my humble opinion, this region has the opposite problem that the previous two regions had. If anything, it focuses way too much on legendary Pokemon. They're so in your face in this region that there's not even a question as to whether they're from Legends or not. They're basically just dudes who chill in the Walmart parking lot on the weekend. The concept and lore behind the Tapus is cool, but they're entirely too easy to reach, and the process of flying to each of their shrines and consecutively catching all of them doesn't really feel all that fun or earned. Nebby turning into Solgaleo or Lunala was admittedly a really cool plot twist at the time, especially since it contradicts your pre-established knowledge that legendaries don't evolve. But at the same time, are we really slapping a legendary sticker on these two? That's like if Papa John was considered a god in Italy. Anyway, now that I've completely burned any chance of getting that sponsorship, let's discuss Type Null and Silvally. Again, why are we labeling these things as legendaries? I mean, sure, Mewtwo's also a man-made creation, but at least he's good. Silvally doesn't even crack bottom tier on his best days. It's also just given away as a gift. Honestly, this Pokemon should be in the same category as Lucario or Zoroark. I don't know what you call that category, maybe like Pokemon that seem important enough to be legendary but aren't actually legendary? Necrozma literally just shows up randomly in the grass in Sun and Moon. Sure, he gets a massive and literal glow up in the Ultra games, but I still can't get over that fact. Why is he just there? Also, even in the Ultra games, the Necrozma plot is handled terribly, don't at me. And then any returning legendary in these games just shoved into the Ultra wormholes in the post-game, which is probably the least interesting way they could possibly go about it. In 6th place, we have Galar. Admittedly, Galar would have probably come in last place if it weren't for the Crown Tundra DLC, significantly improving how legendaries were handled. Although, I think Zacian and Zamazenta's lore and build-up was handled much better than the previous region's box legendaries, but they still feel way less cool to catch. Pushing their catches to the post-game was fine in my opinion, but the Swordward and Shieldbird plot was the absolute worst way to get there. I kinda wish that the whole Eternatus plot had just been the post-game instead, so that way you'd still complete the league without having access to these comically broken legendaries. But that's a much larger issue with Sword and Shield story and structure. As for Eternatus itself, involving the third legendary in the base game's plot for once instead of milking it for a cheaply produced third version for more money was actually a significant step in the right direction in my opinion. Again, I only wish it were a post-game catch instead, but it's a big improvement on how many third legendaries were handled in their base games, especially compared to Zygarde and Necrozma. Anyway, Isle of Armor, that sure happened. But Crown Tundra is where I want to focus most of my attention. The stuff involving Calyrex and the horses is pretty standard meh story material, but I love how this expansion handled the other legendaries. The Galarian birds, the Swords of Justice, and the Regis. The Galarian birds are probably the best iteration of roaming legendaries we've ever had. They feel more like an actual fun game to engage with rather than operating a faulty GPS from the early 2000s. The Swords of Justice keep your eyes peeled looking for footprints across the Crown Tundra, which, hey, may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I found it decently fun. And while I do think the Regis were probably handled way better in Hoenn, I still enjoyed their little riddles even if they were pretty easy. And capping that storyline off with a raid battle against a level 100 Regigigas was beyond cool. And through Dynamax Adventures, pretty much every previous legendary was able to return as well. And for the first time ever, many of these legendaries can be easily shiny hunted. Normally, I dislike when they bring back tons of legendaries and heap them all together in one feature like the Ultra Space rides, but this was certainly the most fun way of handling it. Unless you have no friends, but that's a you problem, not a me problem. So now that I've reached the midpoint of this video, I know it may come as a shock that I haven't discussed Kanto at all until now. This region only has 4 legendaries, not counting Mew, who's mythical and unavailable through normal means, and none of them are tied to the plot at all. Heck, only Mewtwo has substantial lore in these games. So dang it, JPR, how could Kanto possibly rank above Kalos, Johto, Alola, and Galar? And my answer is simply that this region established what makes a legendary Pokemon great. Zapdos and Articuno both live in secluded optional environments like the Power Plant and Seafoam Islands, serving as rewards for the player's curiosity. Moltres is the odd one out, being found in the required area of Victory Road in both Gen 1 as well as Let's Go, but even it gets a substantial upgrade in Fire Red and Leaf Green, being moved to Mount Ember, another optional area that's relatively challenging to get through. Nobody tells you how to get these Pokemon, and I'm sure that when most of us came across them, we were just exploring those areas for fun, not expecting to be greeted by something so powerful. As for Mewtwo, it essentially serves as the game's final boss, the ultimate reward for completing all there was to complete, including the lengthy dungeon of Cerulean Cave. And while none of these legendaries tie into the plot with Team Rocket, I really enjoy how the mansion on Cinnabar Island establishes Mewtwo's iconic lore. It feels dark and foreboding, which is a great contrast for the rest of the Kanto region. It's almost like it's saying, you haven't met this creature yet, but it's out there, and you better be ready. So despite the lack of story and the lack of legendary Pokemon in general, I believe that legendary Pokemon are one of the aspects that those games handle the best. It's a classic example of less being more. This region treats them much more like proper rewards rather than checkpoints in the story, and I think that's really cool. So we're officially in the top 4 now, and I think that for the time being, this is where Paldea is going to reside. First off, I think I speak for almost everyone when I say Koraidon and Miraidon's development throughout the game exceeded expectations. Well, I use the term development lightly, it is Pokemon after all. But the backwards approach of teaming up with the legendary in the beginning of the game and growing alongside it as it gradually regains its powers is a neat concept, I must say. It also just works remarkably well rolling everything into one rideable Pokemon for an open world game where obviously having multiple traversal options is going to be a huge plus. While initially I didn't like how the final boss was simply a second catchable Koraidon or Miraidon, it does make sense from a gameplay perspective since you need to trade with friends to complete the Pokedex, and obviously you can't trade your mount. And then we have the 4 Treasures of Ruin, who do have a fair bit of lore to them if you actually go out of your way to do the history classes at the Academy. Or you can be cool like me and skip school to actually play the game and look up the lore later on the internet. But the lore isn't what's most important, if I haven't made that abundantly clear already. It's how you find them. Again, these legendaries also play into the open world nature of this game very well, requiring you to find 8 stakes each in order to open their chambers and challenge them to battle. In a way, they feel much like older legendary Pokemon such as the Birds or the Regis, but adapted in a more modern way. And this certainly isn't the end, as the books from the Academy Library already allude to at least 3 more legendary Pokemon coming in an expansion pass relatively soon. I like that, kinda like Mewtwo, it's a tease of what's to come. It piques your interest without giving away too much. Certainly, Paldea could rise or fall depending on how the DLC is handled, but I think as far as the legendaries go, they're on the right track. Before we get to the top 3, I'd like to remind everyone that the vast majority of people watching aren't subscribed. So if you're enjoying the video and you want to help me get to 200k, please drop me a sub, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, that's it, bye. In 3rd place, the Unova region. Since we just discussed the Treasures of Ruin, let's also throw the Swords of Justice into that same conversation as well. In Black and White, these 3 certainly feel like a throwback to the legendary birds. They're strictly meant as rewards for exploring, and I would say it feels pretty good to find and catch them. Admittedly, this trio was a rare fumble from Black 2 and White 2, opting instead to place all 3 of them in the middle of random routes since their original locations are no longer accessible. The Forces of Nature are a notably bad look in both pairs of games as they are roaming legendaries in Black and White 1, how dare you, and in Black and White 2, they're actually not in those games at all unless you catch them on Pokemon Dream Radar, a separate 3DS application. Look man, I'm all for experimentation with new ways of catching Pokemon, but I'm not a huge fan of locking these guys in their new forms behind a new console that many at the time didn't have. The Bucks legendaries Zekrom and Reshiram, I would argue, are the best handled of them all. Not only does Black and White find a way to seamlessly integrate both of them into the main story for the first time, but they also have some of the best lore and inspirations behind them as well. As for Kyurem, he's handled pretty much like a standard 3rd game legendary is, nothing to report. I think where Unova shines most though is Black 2 and White 2's integration of returning legendary Pokemon. Whether it's the Lake Trio, the Regis, Latios, Latias, or any of the others, this is probably the best any game has tackled a large cast of older legendaries. They all get their own designated areas, both new areas exclusive to the postgame, or areas that you simply may want to revisit from the main story. I especially like how the Lake Trio shows up in areas that correspond with their theming, like Uxie being at the library for knowledge, or Mesprit at the top of a Pokemon graveyard for emotion. Overall, Unova definitely has a lot of big hits, but admittedly a few misses when it comes to the newer legendaries. In second place is Sinnoh, definitely the region where legendaries felt the most important, oftentimes being portrayed as literal gods. The build-up to the confrontation with Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina at Spear Pillar is handled wonderfully across all the games, and that even includes Legends Arceus. I have no complaints about the core 3 at all. The Link Trio is fine, despite not being hard to find, minus Mesprit, who is unfortunately another roaming legendary god I hated here. But the main story involves them enough to where you kinda had to know where to find them. I can give them a pass for not being as hard to find as some other legendaries. My only real complaint with this region's legendaries is that a few of them feel really insignificant, namely Heatran and Cresselia. This is where I think we started stepping into legendary oversaturation, the point where many might say that they began to feel less special, which to an extent I can agree with. While Gen 7 and 8 certainly have more, and there is a reason why they're ranked significantly lower, 9 legendaries was still a lot for back then. Also, the 3 birds are back again in Platinum, and of course, all 3 of them are roaming. That's 5 roaming legendaries. That's 5 too many if you ask me. And then BDSP just does that thing where it's like, here you go, here's all the legendaries in one spot. We're not gonna get creative with this at all. Have fun. Again, this is just the worst way to approach legendaries in my opinion. If I gotta catch Zapdos for the 80th time, at least let me go find it somewhere instead of stuffing it in an overly convenient room. But not through roaming though. Let me make that clear. Believe me, I'd love to pretend that BDSP didn't exist, but sadly, it did. Which of course leaves only one region at the top. Hoenn. Although I think Hoenn's overall story is a bit lackluster, no story does a better job at hyping up the end-of-the-world Doomsday event like these games do with Groudon and Kyogre. Except maybe Legends Arceus, that was pretty good too. When Groudon and Kyogre get released from the Seafloor Chamber, there is a palpable sense of dread lingering over nearly the entire region. This was the perfect demonstration of these ain't your grandpa's legendary Pokemon anymore. These are serious world-afflicting threats. And in Emerald, Rayquaza gets the first true cutscene in Pokemon history when it flies off to confront Groudon and Kyogre. To this day, there is still nothing cooler. And you know I gotta talk about the Regis and the Braille Quest. If you call it overhyped, you just weren't there at the time. You don't get it. Everyone wonders how were kids supposed to figure this out without the internet back in 2003? And truthfully, there was a Braille translation guide in the instruction manual. Everyone just kind of conveniently forgets about that. But nonetheless, this is probably the single coolest way to access a legendary trio. Finding a cryptic puzzle underneath the ocean of a completely optional route. And I might add, the actual chambers of the Regis aren't exactly sitting on the side of the road. They also exist in locations where a little more exploration was required. The only black mark on this region is the roaming Latios and Latias. They definitely could have done something a lot cooler. Which they did in Oras, but I don't really agree with making that a required catch when you only have 5 badges, so the Eon duo is still questionably handled at best. And you know, as far as the rings in Oras goes, it's not the most offensive way of finding legendary Pokemon. It sorta serves as an introduction to Hoopa. You still have to go out and find where the rings are at, and sometimes it's just random through soaring. Which, hey, anything that gives extra value to a really cool feature, I will applaud. So compared to Ultra Space or Ramadas Park, this one's not so bad. So I hope I was able to put into words what I feel makes a legendary Pokemon feel truly legendary. Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know down below. But don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more videos in the future. And as always, a big shout out to my channel members. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. I'll see you guys next time.